Good afternoon, students. Today in the osteology class, we are going to study the middle third of the Norma Basalis. Anterior third has been discussed before. Middle third, the boundaries involve the posterior free margin of the hard palate and the imaginary transverse or the horizontal line which is drawn along the anterior margin of the foramen magnum or the line just above the foramen magnum. So the portion between this is the middle third of the Norma Basalis. For the descriptive purposes, we divide the middle part of the Norma Basalis into the median part and the lateral part on the either sides. Now, first of all, here we see this is the posterior free border or the posterior free margin of the vomer bone over here. These are the horizontal plates of the palatine bone. So this posterior free margin of the vomer bone, inferiorly it fuses with this horizontal plate of the palatine bone and superiorly it splits or diverges to form the ala of the vomer. And this ala of the vomer, which the posterior free margin, it diverges superiorly to form this ala of the vomer, it articulates or fixes with the rostrum of the sphenoid. So over here you can see this broad bar of the bone. This broad bar of bone, this is formed by the fusion of two bones, that is the body of the sphenoid above and the basilar part of the occipital bone, so which is also known as basi-occiput. So the broad bar of the bone, it is formed by the fusion of the body of the sphenoid with the basi-occiput, and the ala of the vomer, it articulates or fixes with the rostrum of the sphenoid. Moving on to the broad bar of the bone. This broad bar of the bone, in its median plane, it presents an elevation. This elevation is called as the pharyngeal tubercle. This pharyngeal tubercle, it provides attachment to the pharyngeal raphe and also it gives insertion to the superior constrictor muscles of the pharynx. On either side of this elevation of this pharyngeal tubercle, it gives insertion to the longus capitis muscle. Below this area, it provides insertion to the rectus capitis anterior. The part above the pharyngeal tubercle, this forms the roof of the nasopharynx. Moving on to when we keep this vault in anatomical position or when we see it posteriorly, you find, first of all, you know, this is the horizontal plate of the palatine bone, and this is the perpendicular plate of the palatine bone. Now, from the perpendicular plate of the palatine bone, it fuses with this medial pterygoid plate. This is the perpendicular plate of the palatine bone, and this perpendicular plate, it sends a process medially over here, and this process, it is called as the sphenoidal process of the palatine bone. Similarly, this is the medial pterygoid plate and this is the lateral pterygoid plate. The medial pterygoid plate, this also sends a process medially just in front of this sphenoidal process of the palatine bone. This is the vaginal process of the medial pterygoid plate. So between this sphenoidal process of the palatine bone and the vaginal process of the medial pterygoid plate, which is a process which has been sent by this medial pterygoid plate medially. So between these two processes lies a canal over here. This canal over here, it is called as the palatino-vaginal canal, which is present. This canal which is present between the sphenoidal process of the palatine bone and the vaginal process of the medial pterygoid. This is the palatino-vaginal canal over here. Similarly, you know, this is the ala of the vomer laterally gets superimposed with the superior surface of the vaginal process of the medial pterygoid plate, and it forms another canal over here. This is that canal which is called as the vomerovaginal canal. So if you view it like this, you can see this is the vomerovaginal canal which is formed over here, that is between the ala laterally and the vaginal process of the medial pterygoid plate. And you can see anterior to it, this is the vaginal canal, which is formed between the sphenoid. This is formed between the sphenoidal process of the palatine bone and the vaginal process of the medial pterygoid plate. So these are the two canals. One is the vomerovaginal canal. And the other one is the palatino-vaginal canal. Now, this all covers the medial aspect of the middle third of the Norma Basalis. Moving on to the lateral parts of the Norma Basalis. First of all, the bones involved in the lateral part are the sphenoid bone and the temporal bone. Now the sphenoid bone has two parts. This is called as the pterygoid process. This is the pterygoid process. This is the greater wing of the sphenoid over here. And now we have three parts of the temporal bone also. This is the inferior aspect of the petrous part of the temporal bone. This triangular piece of bone, this is the tympanic plate. And over here, this is a squamous part of the temporal bone. So first of all, moving on to the pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone. Here we have the medial pterygoid plate and the lateral pterygoid plate. The medial pterygoid plate, it has two surfaces and the posterior border. This is the medial surface of the medial pterygoid plate and this is the lateral surface of the medial pterygoid plate. And this is the posterior free margin or the posterior free border of the medial pterygoid plate. Similarly, this is the lateral pterygoid plate. This also has a medial surface, a lateral surface and a posterior free border. Now, in the anatomical position, holding in the anatomical position, over here you can see this the posterior free border of the medial pterygoid plate. This inferiorly over here, you can see it forms a process downwards and laterally. This is called as pterygoid hamulus. And superiorly, the posterior free border of the medial pterygoid plate, it forms a depression which is called as scaphoid fossa. This posterior free border of the medial pterygoid, in its whole extent, it provides attachment to the pharyngobasilar fascia. The lower border of this medial pterygoid along with the pterygoid hamulus, this provides origin to the superior constrictor muscles of the pharynx. This pterygoid hamulus over here, which is a process which projects downwards and laterally, this pterygoid hamulus, it provides attachment to the pterygomandibular nerve. Similarly, the lateral pterygoid plate, the medial surface of the lateral pterygoid plate, it provides origin to the deep head of the medial pterygoid muscle. And the superficial head of the medial pterygoid plate, this provides this superficial head of the medial pterygoid will get origin from the maxillary tuberosity and also from the pyramidal process of the palatine bone. The lateral surface of the lateral pterygoid plate gives origin to the lower head of the lateral pterygoid muscle over here. Now, this is the greater wing of the sphenoid over here. You can see this is the greater wing of the sphenoid. Now, the greater wing of the sphenoid, it is pentagonal in shape and it forms the infratemporal part. It forms the infratemporal area. The medial and lateral pterygoid plates, it fuses anteriorly or they are united anteriorly, but posteriorly they form a V-shaped fossa which is called as the pterygoid fossa. Now the anterior united parts of the medial and lateral pterygoid plates, it is separated from this maxilla bone, from the posterior surface of the maxilla bone by the pterygomaxillary fissure. So this is the pterygomaxillary fissure which separates the anterior fused margins of the medial and lateral pterygoids from the posterior surface of the maxilla bone. This is the pterygomaxillary fissure over here separating them. Now after that, this greater wing of the sphenoid, this has various margins. The anteriors, it has an anterior surface. Moving on to the greater wing of the sphenoid, it is pentagonal in shape and presents the following margins: the anterior margin, the anterolateral margin, the posterolateral margin, the anteromedial margin, and the posteromedial margin. The anterior margin of the greater wing of the sphenoid, it forms the posterior margin of the infraorbital fissure. So this is the inferior orbital fissure. So the anterior margin of this greater wing of the sphenoid, it forms the posterior margin of the inferior orbital fissure over here. Similarly, moving on to the anterolateral margin. The anterolateral margin is also called as infratemporal crest. The posterolateral margin, you can see there is a well-defined suture over here. This posterolateral margin, it is separated from the squamous part of the temporal bone. The anteromedial margin of the greater wing of the sphenoid, it is continuous with the pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone, and the posteromedial margin, it is separated from the petrous part of the temporal bone. The posterolateral margin and the posteromedial margin, the posterolateral and the posteromedial margin, both of them, they become continuous, or they become united to form the spine of the sphenoid. This is the spinous process of the spine of the sphenoid, which is very important. It is laterally related to the auriculotemporal nerve. Medially, it is related to the cauda tympani and the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube, which posteriorly and behind merges with the bony part of the eustachian or the auditory tube. Now the spine of the sphenoid, it gives attachment to two muscles, that is the tensor tympani and the tensor veli palatini, and also gives attachment to three important ligaments, out of which one is most important, is it is attached to this spine of the sphenoid is attached the sphenomandibular ligament, the pterygospinous ligament, and the anterior ligament of the malleus, out of which the sphenomandibular ligament is most important. After that, the posteromedial margin of the greater wing of the sphenoid, it presents various foraminas. Anteriorly, it presents the foramen ovale. Through the foramen ovale passes four things, that is the mandibular nerve, the accessory meningeal artery, lesser petrosal nerve, and the emissary vein. Posterolateral to this foramen ovale lies the foramen spinosum. Through this passes the middle meningeal artery, the posterior division of the middle meningeal vein, and the meningeal branch of the mandibular nerve, which is also called as nervus spinosus. So this is the foramen spinosus, and this is the foramen ovale, and more posterior lateral to this foramen spinosum lies the spine of the sphenoid, as we have discussed before. Now, coming on to the petrous part of the temporal bone, it is triangular shaped, and towards its inferior part, on the inferior side towards its posterior part, there lies a canal which is called as a carotid canal. So over here, you can see this is the carotid canal present over here. This carotid canal, through it passes the internal carotid artery and the sympathetic plexus and venous plexus around the internal carotid artery. So inferiorly, the posterior part of the petrous part of the temporal bone, it is perforated by the lower part of the carotid canal. And the apex of this petrous part, it presents the upper part of the carotid canal. This is the lower part of the carotid canal. Now the apex, from this apex, there forms another foramina which is called as foramen lacerum. So this is the foramen lacerum which is present near the apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone. Through this foramen lacerum passes the emissary veins, the meningeal branch of the ascending pharyngeal artery. Towards the upper part of the foramen lacerum, there is presence of the internal carotid artery, the greater petrosal nerve and the deep petrosal nerve. Both these nerves, they become united to form the nerve to the pterygoid canal, which is called as Vidian's nerve, which leaves this foramen lacerum through its anterior wall. So, the various foramina briefly are foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, more posterolaterally the spine of the sphenoid, and over here in the petrous part there is foramen lacerum, and towards inferior posterior aspect of the petrous part there is the carotid canal. Moving on to the tympanic plate, which is the second part of the temporal bone. In this lateral aspect of the middle third of the Norma Basalis, here you can see the apex which is behind the spine of the sphenoid. This is the apex which is directed medially, and the base of this tympanic plate, this is free and curved. The base or this curved base of the tympanic plate, it is related to the anterior, inferior and the lower part of the wall of the external acoustic meatus. And this tympanic plate, it presents the posterior aspect of the mandibular fossa. So it is related to the posterior aspect of the mandibular fossa, this tympanic plate, and related to the anterior, inferior and medial and the lower part of the walls of the external acoustic meatus also. After this, moving on to the squamous part of the temporal bone. The squamous part of the temporal bone, it presents the anterior part. So the base of the tympanic plate of the temporal bone, this forms the anterior, inferior and the lower part of the posterior wall of the external acoustic meatus. Moving on to the last part of the temporal bone, the squamous part of the temporal bone, it forms the anterior part of the mandibular fossa, which articulates with the head of the mandible to form temporomandibular joint. Now, after that, over here you see presence of an articular tubercle. This is formed by the anterior and the posterior roots of this zygomatic arch. These unite to form this articular tubercle, and the anterior aspect of the mandibular fossa, this articulates with the head of the mandible to form the temporomandibular joint, and the posterolateral aspect of the squamous part of the temporal bone, it forms the roof of the infratemporal fossa. This is all about the middle third of the Norma Basalis, involving the median part and the lateral part extending up to the zygomatic arches. The posterior third will be discussed in the subsequent videos. Thank you.